Warm welcome to this lecture series on organizational behavior. We are in this chapter on organization structure, and this is going to be our last lecture in this chapter. So I'll quickly summarize what happened in the earlier lectures in this chapter. So we defined what is organizational structure. We looked at different dimensions of organizational structure, out of which we selected only 3 and discussed elaborately on those 3 dimensions. Those are complexity, formalization, and centralization. When we discussed about complexity, we looked at 3 kinds of complexity, or 3 complexity arising from 3 different types of differentiation. So complexity denotes how many subgroups are in the organization. So the subgroups can be at horizontal levels, which is differentiating horizontally. Subgroups can be at a vertical level, which is different hierarchies, different levels in the hierarchy. Spatial differentiation is differentiating or creating groups in terms of different geographical locations, or the manufacturing units or the offices of an organization at different places. We also looked at what kind of mechanisms can be used to reduce the the negative effects of differentiation on organization. So we looked at the horizontal coordination mechanisms. We looked at vertical differentiation and coordination mechanisms. We also looked at formalization as the next dimension of organizational structure. Formalization denotes the written policies, rules, and procedures. We looked at some of the important issues or important ideas pertaining to formalization. We also looked at how organizations reinforce formalization, or how organizations formalize structure. The third dimension is centralization, in which we looked at the advantages and disadvantages of centralization and when does centralization happen. Centralization is nothing but concentration of power in one place or on one person in the organization. We looked at the advantages and disadvantages of centralization. So this is where we stopped in the previous lecture. We are going to look at, in this last lecture of this chapter, 2 perspectives on organization structure. So if you need to understand organizations, we need to understand few perspectives or few ideas about organizations. Why? Because if you want to understand how people behave in organizations, you need to understand what are organizations and how do we conceptualize an organization. So our understanding about how we are conceptualizing an organization will help us come up with theories or principles to understand human behavior in workplace or human behavior in organizations. So we should understand our understanding of organizations so that we will know how to interpret human behavior in organizations. So this is the connection. And there are many perspectives which are used to understand organizations, but I'm going to talk about 2 important perspectives. The first one is systems perspective. Systems theory is in fact a very popular way of approaching any phenomena or any organism. So the idea here in systems perspective is, systems perspective looks at organizations as systems. We would have heard of this term system in our day-to-day language. So what is a system? System is a collection of interdependent and interrelated parts arranged in a way that it looks like a unified whole. For example, a computer. So a computer, from a user's point of view, it's a computer, it's one unit. But if we dismantle the computer, there will be different parts, and each of these parts will have its own way of working. And each of the parts, if you dismantle them further, you will find even further smaller parts in those sub parts. So this is what is a system. A system is a collection of different parts. When they come together, they become a holistic entity. A system also takes an input, involves certain processes, and then gives some output. For example, this computer, it takes in information. There is a user who has a certain kind of a need. Depending on the need, that information is processed, and then we get an output. There are many forms or many kinds of systems. For example, our human body is a biological system in which we have many subsystems like respiratory system, circulatory system, nervous system, and things like that. If you look at circulatory system, within it there will be different types of systems. For example, in nervous system you have autonomous nervous system and sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous systems, and there are different units. Even within autonomous nervous system, there will be like each neuron is a entity by itself. Within the neuron, there will be cells, nerve cells, and the subunits of nerve cells. So, if you take humans as a unit, if you go below, you will find subsystems. Similarly, humans are part of the larger society. So, humans are subsystems of society, and society is a subsystem of a country, a political entity. Country is a subsystem of a continent. Continent is a subsystem of the globe. The globe is a subsystem of solar system. Solar system is a subsystem of Milky Way. At every level, any unit will be a subsystem of a larger unit, and also that particular unit will have different subsystems. So this way of understanding organizations helps us see the interconnectedness and help us understand what is our unit of analysis. So let's say organization, if you want to understand people's behavior in an organization, a person's behavior in an organization he or she belongs to different subsystems, different layers of subsystem, and also different subsystems. Different layers of subsystem because he or she belongs to an organization and also belongs to a department, and also he or she belongs to a certain profession. There are different layers. Similarly, there are different systems. He or she is part of different systems, subsystems. The employee is part of the organization, which is a system. The employee is part of society, which is a system. Employee is part of a family, which is a system. So there are multiple systems in which the employee is part of. So understanding these complexities will help us understand the interconnectedness, and that will help us predict or understand behavior in a better way, because we know what are the influencing factors. So one thing we need to understand, or one important knowledge systems perspective helps us to acknowledge, is interrelationship of parts within the system. So every subsystem in a larger system interact with the other subsystem. So for example, circulatory system interacts with the respiratory system. Respiratory system and circulatory system interact with nervous system. Similarly, digestive system has an influence on circulatory system and respiratory system. So every system is like connected with each other. Even though they are units in their own sense, they have connections with other entities. So why this knowledge is important? Because the connections between different systems, one, they influence each other. Two, they depend on each other. So for a system to function properly, it depends on the other subsystem in that particular unit. Okay, and also if something happens to one system, it influences the other system as well. So this is the interconnectedness, which says these subsystems should cooperate. Okay, so for example, in an organization there are different departments. So each of those departments are subsystems on their own. And within departments, if there are large organizations, there are many subsystems underneath a department. Or let's say if it's a huge conglomerate of an organization, like a company like Tata, there are many businesses Tata is involved, or Unilever. So there are many sub organizations within the larger umbrella of Unilever. So these subunits, we can consider those subunits as systems by themselves. But these subunits also are connected by, they are also interdependent on each other. They also need to cooperate with each other. So this is one important understanding. On the other hand, the opposite of cooperation is competition. Even within the system, the subsystems need to compete with each other, or there is a need for them to compete with each other, because they need to take the fair share of resources which is available for the larger system. So let's say an organization, every year there is budgeting. So every department will seek its share. They will say, no, we need a better share. For example, in a country like India, we have different states. We belong to one system, which is India. But even then, each of these states, they share some resources, and they depend on each other for certain things. So this dependency also creates competition, where, for example, different states have conflicts in terms of water resources, or electricity, or people moving from one state to another. So there's always this conflict which exists between different subsystems. So every subsystem should learn to manage this paradox of conflict and cooperation. So what will happen if a subsystem cooperates too much with the other subsystems? It will lose its identity. And if it loses its identity, and if it loses its existence, let's say if respiratory system says, I'm not going to take energy because other systems need energy, other subsystems like circulatory system and nervous system. So if respiratory system says that, it will stop to exist. So if it stops to exist, the larger system, the human body, will also collapse. On the other hand, if the subsystem tries to compete too much, they try to damage other systems so that it survives, that conflict is so high, it can also affect the larger system, because conflict can harm each other. Extreme conflicts can harm each other in the system. Subsystems they fight with each other, and it leads to harm, and the larger system also collapses. So, but there should be only when there is a balance, the larger system can function, and also the subsystem can function. So the role is on the larger system as well as on the subsystem to manage this paradox, conflict versus cooperation, in the right balance. So organizations also should ensure that there is enough conflict and competitiveness to make people motivated, and there is enough interdependency and cooperation to make them work together and not affect the larger goals. So this is one important paradox. The second paradox, or the second challenge for any organization or any system, is every subsystem has its own need to be differentiated, which means the subsystem has its own identity. They want to establish their own identity, or it wants to assert itself as a system of its own. And also it has, since it belongs to another system, it also need to identify itself with the larger system. So for example, a country like India, every state has its own identity in terms of language, in terms of cultural practices, in terms of history. So the state, it's quite normal for any state or any region of a country to feel proud about their regional identity. But at the same time, they should also identify themselves with the larger identity, which is the country. So if you take larger globe as a system, every country has its own identity. So every country should have its pride. At the same time, we all should understand we are all humans. Okay, so our larger identity is humans. So at any given point in time, a subsystem will have this paradox of whether to differentiate or distinguish itself as a separate unit, or whether to identify itself with the larger unit. So if it differentiates too much, then it will lose its connection with the larger system. If it identifies too much with the larger system, it will lose its identity of subsystem, which is not good, because if every system loses its identity, it will affect the larger system also. Okay. So these are some of the challenges systems perspective describes as challenges for organizations. And also another important knowledge which systems perspective gives us to understand organizations is every organization or every system can be looked at from the perspective of closed system versus open system. So closed systems are the ones which differentiate too much from the larger system, which means they have their own identity. They don't interact with other entities in the neighboring system or within the larger system. Open systems are the ones which interact a lot with other systems in the larger system. Okay, so every organization, again, there is a dilemma whether to close yourself as a separate entity or to open your boundaries so that you can interact a lot with the other entities. But the problem is, if you interact or if you open your boundaries too much, you will lose your identity as the subsystem. Because for example, if there are too many collaborations an organization makes with other entities, there will be a lot of influence of those collaborations on this organization. So it will affect the internal processes of the organization. On the other hand, if the organization doesn't interact with other entities, if they don't collaborate with other entities, they will lose their survival skills, because only when you interact with others in the environment, you will be able to adapt to the changes. Okay, so this is again an important challenge. When you talk about so organizations should have an ideal level of openness. So this is like a continuum. You can be very closed or very open. So the ideal thing is somewhere in between. And organizations should also know when to be very open and when to be closed. Another important concept I would like to talk about with regard to this idea is boundary spanning. Boundary spanning means organizations have their own boundaries. If you remember, when you spoke about the definition of organization, you spoke about boundaries. So every organization has a boundary, physical boundary, boundary in terms of scope, boundary in terms of identity, things like that. So every organizational boundary, the organization should ensure there are enough ways in which this organization can span boundaries, which means cross the boundary so that they can interact with people from outside and then back to the organization. It is like jobs like marketing, sales jobs, or supplier management. These jobs are boundary management jobs, where these people interact with people from outside, stakeholders from outside, and understand their needs, the challenges which they can pose, and then use that information within the organization so that organization can adapt better to challenges. So in fact, this idea of boundary spanning is like a very large area of a very large discipline of study. But in a very simple sense, boundary spanning means ensuring that the organizational boundaries are kept open at an ideal level and assign people so that they can cross the boundaries and interact with others outside the boundary and use that information for the effectiveness of the organization. Okay. The next perspective I'm going to talk about is life cycle perspective. So this perspective looks at organization as an organism. So when you say organism, any organism, the characteristics of any organism is there will be birth, and there'll be death, and there'll be different stages in between. For example, if there's a plant, the plant undergoes different stages and becomes a tree, and maybe after a certain number of years it dies. Similarly, an organism like a cell, biological cell, it undergoes different changes. At some point it dies. So it holds true for any organism. Similarly, organizations are also organisms according to this perspective. When we say organisms, there are different stages or different life cycle. It undergoes a certain life cycle, and each life cycle there are different stages. So according to there are many theories which use life cycle perspective to understand organization, but this one classifies 4 stages of the organizational life cycle. The first stage is entrepreneurial stage, where the organization is formed. There are very few people in the organization. This is like a startup kind of an organization, and the goals are very ambiguous. People are not very sure what are their long-term plans. Many a times startups are created by some passion of an entrepreneur. So that's why it's called entrepreneurial stage. The entrepreneur drives the organization. So there is no clarity, but there is a lot of creativity. In fact, ambiguity or uncertainty can lead to better creativity. Okay, so uncertainty encourages people to take risk, encourage people to think out of the box. So organizations at this stage are highly creative, but there are high levels of uncertainty. Another important challenge for these kind of organizations at this level is they need a lot of support, because they are at a very young stage. So they need a lot of resources in terms of expertise, in terms of mentoring, in terms of incubation, in terms of funding, space, and things like that. And this is a stage where many organizations die. We call them, or significant number of organizations die. We call them infant mortality, liability of newness, where since you are new entity, there are a lot of chances that you may cease to exist. Okay. And the second stage is collectivity stage, where the organization starts growing, crosses the entrepreneurial stage, where the number of people in the organization also increases. There is some clarity in terms of which direction they are going to move. To some level, communication structure becomes crystallized, but again there's a lot of informality. At least people understand the need for certain kind of an organization structure. And communication also is informal, but there are some ways in which these communication between the organization is formalized. And again, people are like highly committed, because there are few number of people, young organization, lot of commitment from the members of the organization. So according to institutional theory, we can use this institutional isomorphism theory, which means there's a lot of pressure on these organizations to adapt or to become like existing organizations. So, since there is less clarity, for them, the clarity is from other organizations who are well established in this area. All this benchmarking happens. The third stage is formalization and control stage. This is like 30 years or 40 years of adult life, 30s, 40s of adult life. So structure is stabilized. The organization settles. Rules are clearly prescribed and they are imposed. And innovation is de-emphasized, because there's already a structure, there's already some level of certainty. There is no need for disruption, or there is no need for risk taking. So innovation is de-emphasized. Decision making has become more conservative, because formalization is high, everything is like clearly written down. People tend to use those guidelines to make decisions. So decisions become very conservative, and role clarity becomes very high. Everybody knows what they have to do, and organization exists beyond the individual. If you consider earlier two stages, the leader or the founder is a major driving force. The founder's value system and the founder's belief system drives the organization, and everybody knows the leader very well, the founder very well, and the founder also has a lot of control over the organization. But at the third stage, the leader slowly loses, or the founder slowly loses his or her power, because the organization grows into a very large organization, and rules are like clearly written down. You don't need the leader as an inspiration or the guiding force. Even if you need the leader or the founder as a guiding force, it is just symbolic in nature. You don't actually go and have to seek guidance in all situations. Maybe in few situations the founder member advice is required, or the founder member intervenes. The fourth stage is elaboration of structure stage. So the organization diversifies into different products. So they have grown beyond the specific product which or service they have started. So now they diversify because they have to grow. The only way to grow is either inorganic growth, you acquire similar companies, or you grow organically, which means you diversify into related businesses. For example, if you are if you're an IT company, probably you can get into other technology based businesses. Or if you are a food company, food based organization, food manufacturing organization, you can get into probably other agriculture related business, dairy business, or paper business, things like that. So diversification happens in terms of related products, and growth opportunities are sought. This is like the organization becomes a lot of competitive in terms of seeking growth opportunities. So when they grow bigger, the structure becomes more complex because the organization has to manage different products, product ranges, different kind of customers, different suppliers. So there'll be different departments. So the structure becomes very complex, and slowly that leads to decentralization. So each of these sub products become different entities. So the organization, each of the product lines at some point will become a different brand itself. Okay. So for example, a company like Nestle, there are different products in them. So beyond a certain point, even like for example Maggi, which is part of Nestle, now looks like it's a separate brand, and Nestle's chocolate is treated as a separate brand. So the decentralization becomes a necessity of high levels of product diversification. The last stage is decline stage. So beyond a certain point, you cannot grow as an organization, and there will be competitors. And beyond a certain point, managing such a huge business becomes difficult. So decentralization can lead to these individual entities becoming separate entities on their own. So they will lose their connection with the larger organization, and probably the organization also becomes very complacent because they are there in the market for very long. They have made so much profits, they lose track of the competition, and also in the market there will be increased competition or change in the technology. So since the organization is pretty big, they are not able to adapt to the technological changes or competition in terms of new competition and innovations. So that may lead to decline. And also employee may leave because the organization is there for very long, it becomes complacent. People may think, or the newer generation employees may leave because the culture may not suit. There might be conflicts also, conflicts between different product ranges, between departments, between people, because there is always this pressure in terms of, if you remember the systems theory, differentiation versus integration. So it can lead to conflict. And after a certain point, maybe the organization will try to take centralized decision, or they try to centralize all the important decision under new leadership. So this is a stage where turnaround happens. Turnaround means there's a decline, but if the organization understands they are declining and they are adaptive and they are open, they bring in a new leadership. So this is like rebirth. They are again going to entrepreneurial stage where we call it turnaround management. Everything has to be rearranged. Most of the things will be started fresh after decline stage. So again, it will become a kind of a new cycle from entrepreneurial collectivity, formalization, elaboration. So, but if organizations fail to do that, if they fail to do turnaround in during this stage, they may die or they may cease to exist. So the life cycle perspective helps us understand organizations based on which stage are they in, and what kind of ethical, what kind of values drive the organization, and how it has an impact on employees, and what kind of culture emerges at this particular stage, and what kind of leadership exists. So this in fact gives a very deep knowledge of organizations if you understand which stage they are in, which stage the organization is in. So in fact there are multiple theories, like I said, perspectives to understand organization. Okay, so I'll stop here. In fact this is also the end of the the OB course, and I thank a lot I thank you all for being patient and listening to my lectures, and I hope the lectures were useful. And I also thank the NPTEL organizers and SWAYAM organizers for giving me this opportunity, and we'll try to meet again, maybe through another course or maybe some other forum. Okay, so till then, take care, have a nice time, all the best.